From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Daniel Boomhauer. I'm the head of Reader Services here in the Music Division, and I am joined tonight by two editors of the complete works of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, which they actually state as Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the complete works, but that's purely grammatical. The topic, as you can see on the screen, that we'll be discussing tonight is editing and performing the music of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. And just so that you know who we are, I will set the model and introduce myself a little further. I work here in the music division. I'm trained as a librarian and also as a musicologist. And one of the great pleasures I have here is to oversee a collection that's very rich in primary source materials. So it's in occasions like this that it's so nice to talk about our collections and talk about the kinds of things that that our collections are inform in terms of research and performance. So I'll let Paula Corneilson and Mark Knoll introduce themselves.
I'm Paul Corneilson. I'm managing editor of the complete works of C.P.E. Bach. I've been working in Cambridge, Massachusetts at our editorial office for about 15 years now. Before that, I did my graduate school work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and worked on the New Grove Dictionary of Opera in London for a couple of years before joining AR Editions and recent researches in music in Wisconsin. That was in the 90s, and then I moved to Boston in 2000. So I've been there going on 15 years now. And Mark is one of my colleagues.
Mark Knoll. Is this on? Yeah. I completed my dissertation in musicology at the University of Michigan in 1998, a dissertation that explored statistical means for trying to resolve authenticity questions in works by the Bach sons. There are quite a number of works out there that are either attributed to multiple Bach sons or that are attributed only to Bach, and we have a heck of a time trying to sort those out when we're doing a complete edition. I spent some time in Berlin, where I was a member of the Sing Academy, which was founded by C.P.E. Bach's student and later colleague, Carl Friedrich Christian Fasch, in 1791, and it still exists. I can only take partial credit for the fact that the Berlin Wall fell just a few weeks after I arrived, but I'll take partial credit for that. In 2000, I founded my own music publishing company called Stegline Publishing, and in 2004, I joined the staff at the C.P.E. Bach Complete Works Edition.
One thing I want to mention is that the complete works of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach are one of the major scholarly projects that's supported by the Packard Humanities Institute, and it's through their generosity that Paul and Mark are here tonight, and they're co-sponsors for our concerts this weekend. The Packard Humanities Institute is also a generous supporter of the Library of Congress, and it was through Packard that the former Federal Reserve facility in Culpeper, Virginia was renovated and formed as our National Audiovisual Conservation Center. So the library is continuing its relationship with the Packard Humanities Institute in our talk tonight. I think the best thing for us to do is to start by talking about who C.P.E. Bach was and kind of talk about his life and kind of take him out of the shadows of his father's much greater notoriety. So tell us, who was this guy?
He was the second surviving son of Johann Sebastian Bach. He was born on March 8th, 1714 in Weimar, Germany. His sponsors at the baptismal font were a man named Emanuel and the famous musician Georg Philipp Telemann. So it was tradition at the time that the child take on the names of the sponsors. So we have Emanuel and Philipp figured out. The third sponsor was a woman named Dorothea, so we haven't quite figured out where Karl has come from. His birthplace no longer exists in Weimar. It was damaged in the Second World War, and in the 60s it was torn down, and a hotel was built next door to it, and the site where Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach was born is now a parking lot for this hotel. There is a movement afoot to purchase that parking lot and rebuild the house there. The foundation of the house is still there under the parking lot, and they have the plans so they can rebuild it. But apparently the owner of the parking lot is still not interested in selling it. When C.P.E. Bach was 3 years old, his father took a position at a princely court at Curtin, either C or K, and then O umlaut T-H-E-N. And J.S. Bach was active at that court for 8 years. And in 1723, he switched jobs again. That is Johann Sebastian Bach switched jobs again to become music director in the city of Leipzig. And one of the reasons that he gave for making this change, which at the time could be viewed as a demotion, going from Kapellmeister to Cantor, but Bach wanted to move to a university city so that his children, or his sons, could attend university and get a university education, which Johann Sebastian himself never had the opportunity to do. So it was partly because of the fact that he had Wilhelm Friedemann, the oldest son, and Carl Philipp Emanuel, that J.S. Bach decided to move to Leipzig in 1723 and begin work in the service of the church there.
So C.P. Bach says in his autobiography that his father was his only tutor, his only teacher, and he became a choir boy at St. Thomas's. He started at the University of Leipzig, but eventually switched to the Prussian University at Frankfurt an der Oder when he was about 20 years old. Just recently we've found one of his earliest vocal compositions, a cantata that he wrote while he was still in Leipzig, and we've published this in the edition. So while he was in Frankfurt Oder, he was director of the musical activities there, including a Collegium Musicum, and eventually by around 1738, he became affiliated with the Crown Prince of Prussia, later Frederick the Great, or Frederick II, and left the university to join Frederick's entourage, first at Rupin and later in Berlin when he became king in 1740. So he spent almost 30 years in the service of Frederick the Great as his principal accompanist. So he was taking part in nightly concerts at Sanssouci, and eventually was able to succeed his godfather Telemann as the music director of the 5 principal Lutheran churches in Hamburg, Germany.
So that's there are several phases of Bach's career, and it kind of each one is the music that he wrote was produced in direct relation to his personal and professional circumstances, right? So in Frankfurt, there's cantatas and keyboard works. In Berlin, there's much more in the way of keyboard music and concertos, keyboard concertos, and chamber music, primarily serving the sort of the non-court musical scene, which was mostly private societies, correct? And then it's not until he moves to Hamburg that he begins to write sacred music at any significant scale. Is that generally the case?
Yeah, I would say so. Frederick heard C.P.E. Bach give a concert in Frankfurt an der Oder around 1735, and he wrote to his sister and said something like, C.P.E. Bach is a very fine keyboard player, but his musical taste is not yet fully formed. So he was this is Frederick writing about a 20-year-old musician. And it's interesting that a few years later, in 1742, Bach published his first set of 6 keyboard sonatas, and he dedicated them to Frederick the Great. We call them the Prussian sonatas today. And this is his Opus 1, and these works do show a very well-formed musical taste and style. And over the time he was in Berlin, he was writing mainly instrumental music, especially keyboard music. And in the early 1750s, he produced a treatise on keyboard playing, which is still one of the most important documents we have for performance practice of the 18th century.
He clearly was trying to establish himself as a keyboard virtuoso from early on. Even before he left his father's house in Leipzig, he was writing keyboard pieces and, in fact, publishing them. He engraved a minuet that he composed very early on, so he was also active in music publishing throughout his life. And he was also very early involved in the development of the keyboard concerto, a genre that really didn't come into its own until the 1730s, primarily through the examples we have from his father, Johann Sebastian. But those keyboard concertos by Johann Sebastian are probably from earlier in the 1720s, but the source that we have for them cannot be dated earlier than 1738. And we have complete keyboard concertos by the young C.P.E. Bach already in 1731 in Leipzig. So the traditional story is that J.S. Bach created the keyboard concerto and then his sons picked it up and developed it further. It may be that this was something going on in the Bach household, that there were more contributors than just the father. After he moved to Frankfurt an der Oder, we kind of lose track of him. We have records of him being there. We have librettos of cantatas that he set, and we have records that he composed keyboard solo music and chamber music and keyboard concertos there, but we don't have any sources from the Frankfurt period. And one of the pieces he composed in Frankfurt was a cantata to celebrate the birthday of Frederick II, who was then crown prince, which probably didn't hurt him in being appointed later to the court when Friedrich got a little more power in Berlin. During his Berlin years, he did concentrate on the keyboard still. His reputation grew considerably as a keyboard player and as a composer for keyboard. that reputation grew even further in 1753 with his Versuch, his treatise on keyboard playing, which achieved quite a wide circulation and carried his name further than his music alone would have. He did compose some choral music, some sacred choral music in Berlin, but that was not his job. His job was to accompany the king at the piano. In fact, his job did not entail composition of any kind. Anything he wrote was strictly on his own time and for his own purposes. We don't think that C.P.E.'s music got performed at court very often, if at all. The king was interested in other styles than C.P.E. Bach's music. But he did have occasion to write a couple major choral works, and that helped him then get the job later in Hamburg, where that would be his principal job, to provide music for the 5 churches in Hamburg.
So could you describe how C.P.E. Bach's music relates to that of, say, his father, stylistically, and then also to the younger composers with whom he was working directly at the court of Frederick the Great, like Karl Heinrich Graun and Johann Joachim Quantz being the principal court composers? What do we hear that's like music that we're probably familiar with today, the music of J.S. Bach, and what is different about C.P.E.'s music?
Well, both C.P.E. Bach and Wilhelm Friedemann Bach were in a tough position, and they both knew it, that they had been raised by one of the greatest composers that ever lived. And in this statement where Bach says that my only teacher in music was my father, he goes on to say that he was unwilling to go further in that direction because he knew he could not exceed what his father had already achieved. So the sons were quite aware and early on that they would have to strike out on their own. Johann Sebastian Bach is known for his amalgamation of various national styles, the Italian style, the French style, the German style. He was master of them all. He would combine them all and create new combinations out of that. The younger generation, immediately following Johann Sebastian Bach, were much taken by the new Italian music, the instrumental music, the concertos of Vivaldi, for example, and the court musicians at Berlin, who were very influenced by, well, the whole court at Berlin was influenced by the court at Dresden. And at Dresden, the Italian style had really taken hold. And not only the court musicians, but Friedrich himself learned the Italian style, principally through the court at Dresden. So what was going on in Berlin was this transplanted Italian style, not this amalgamated style of Johann Sebastian Bach. And what Carl Philipp Emanuel brought was adding to this new Italian style some of the tricks of the trade that he had learned from his father. And so there are lots of surprising twists and turns, lots of unexpected movements that was not part of this new Italian style. And that is what sort of makes C.P.E. Bach unique in Berlin. Most of the other composers were more strictly adhering to the pure Italian style. Now, there were other pupils of Johann Sebastian Bach in Berlin, Agricola and Kernberger, and we get some of this same sort of mixed style from them. But they were not, at least at the beginning, officially associated with the court.
So one of the pieces on tonight's program, it's the Oboe Concerto by C.P.E. Bach. It presents an interesting sort of question for listeners and especially for musicologists and editors. It was and the situation is not dissimilar to the keyboard concertos of his father, where we have a keyboard version of a concerto and then two concertos for violin that also appear as, so there are two versions of these. And in the case, these are J.S. Bach concertos. The oboe concerto that we'll hear tonight is another example where there's an oboe version and then a keyboard version. So I'm wondering, can you explain how, what sort of issues does that present to musicians and even more specifically to editors of the complete works?
Well, we have I have a couple of slides. One of the principal documents we're using is C.P.E. Bach's estate catalog, which was published 2 years after his death in 1790. And I don't know if you can read it, but you can see there's a list of his works organized by genre, so starting with the solo keyboard music and the concertos and various other works, and finally the vocal music, as well as then all the rest of the music that he owned in his library, plus a large portrait collection. The Library of Congress has a unique, well, not a unique, but one of the few surviving copies of this. In fact, I think it's the only one in the United States, but it's one of, say, a dozen surviving copies. And it's one of the first works, one of the first thematic catalogs devoted to a single composer. If you go to the next slide, please. Here's a page from the catalog, and at the very top there's a listing for a concerto number 41 in E flat, composed in Berlin in 1765, and he says it's for keyboard, two violins, viola, and bass, and then it's also set for the oboe. And then you have the first few measures of the piece below that. Well, in fact, that's a little bit misleading because C.P.E. Bach actually wrote this concerto first of all for an oboe solo. If you go to the next slide. Here's the original wrapper in C.P.E. Bach's handwriting for this concerto. So you see at the very bottom of the page the number 41, which matches up to the estate catalog. And so he says, I can't quite read it all, but it's basically a concerto in E flat by C.P.E. Bach with the annotation, ist wenig bekannt. So he's making a note that it's little known. In other words, it didn't circulate very much in the 18th century. And go to the next slide.
Well, I just wanted to jump in here on this musical incipit. The concerto is more exciting than that incipit gives. It does play other notes besides the E flat.
Thank you. But here I hope you can see that, or at least get some sense of it. This is the opening page of the autograph score. So with the oboe part on the top line, and then the two violins and viola and bass. We don't actually have a score of this work for keyboard from Bach's lifetime. And the editor, the man who edited the work for the complete works, wonders whether it was even performed as a keyboard concerto during Bach's lifetime. There's one measure in particular that there's a big clash, a mistake in the parts, and he thinks that if it had been performed in Bach's lifetime, somebody would have corrected it. But in any event, this was a kind of, I think, a kind of challenge for C.P.E. Bach and other composers to adapt a work or a concerto or a trio for different instruments, different scorings. And if you listen to the two versions, we'll hear the oboe version tonight. You can immediately recognize it as the music as the same work, but obviously it's going to sound different with an oboe soloist versus a keyboard soloist. And there are three concertos that Bach actually arranged for a cello, a flute, and a keyboard, all in separate versions, not a triple concerto or anything, but one concerto scored for three different instruments. And he did that 3 times, and there are other 2 oboe concertos that he also arranged for keyboard. And am I answering your question?
I think so, yeah.
And I think it's telling that in all these concertos that he set for multiple instruments, in virtually all cases, they started as a non-keyboard concerto and were arranged later as the keyboard version. But in his estate catalog, he lists them all as keyboard concertos that were also set for other instruments. So I think that's the keyboardist kind of pushing himself forward here.
And we did have a choice when we were deciding how to publish these works in the edition. We discussed the possibility of editing the works as concertos, so putting the 2 or 3 different versions of the work in the same volume, and ultimately we decided to keep them separate by scoring, so that we've published the 2 oboe concertos in a separate volume, and 6 flute concertos in another volume, 3 cello concertos in another volume, and then we have 15 or 16 volumes of keyboard concertos.
So I want to point out to you that there on the table over here are examples of the edition. It's actually a beautifully prepared edition, and it will run to over 100 volumes when it's complete. There are also booklets that it's basically a catalog of the edition. So the copies, the examples, are the property of the federal government, so leave those here. But the the booklets are, you're welcome to take copies of that. And there's also a flyer for the essential C.P.E. Bach, and it's a selection of the sort of greatest hits of C.P.E. Bach, and that's all prepared, these are off-prints from the edition, and it's also very nicely prepared. The edition, because of the generosity of the Packard Humanities Institute, it's extraordinarily affordable, and which is quite remarkable. And one other item that I want to draw to your attention, if your reading sort of inclines to the arcane, then this is for you. This is a facsimile edition of the estate catalog. All the Bach scholars like us call it the Nachlassverzeichnis, which is the German equivalent. And it's a facsimile, so actually that page right there is it's the same image as what's printed in here, and those are generated from the Library of Congress's copy of the estate catalog. This, I believe, sells directly from the distributor for $25. So it's a beautifully prepared edition. And like Paul was saying, it's the first published thematic catalog of a single composer's music. Interestingly, I think that it's the case that Mozart prepared for his own reference a thematic catalog of his compositions at the same time, but it wasn't until in the 19th century that there was a thematic catalog of Mozart's works ever published. So it's a theme that we may discuss further in this conversation, is how C.P.E. Bach was kind of on the forefront of a lot of interesting trends that we recognize 200 years later as being significant, but at the time they were pretty unique. And so the fact that there's this historical, retrospective accounting of Bach's music is really remarkable in its time. They're also available from Amazon.com, off prints in study score format of the most of the orchestral music, correct? Of the selected.
Yeah.
And those are print on demand. They're also very inexpensive. So if you're ready and willing to dig into the actual notes of C.P.E. Bach, there are many great ways to do that because of the edition.
Also, if you're looking to perform any of the chamber, orchestral, or choral works, you can download the parts for these that have already been published in the edition from our website. Just go to www.cpebach.org and go to, I think, performing parts, performing material, and you can download whatever your heart desires.
So that was a long commercial interruption. But exactly. So the case is that Bach himself didn't necessarily place any priority on these different versions of the concertos, so that he's listing the keyboard version in his estate catalog of the oboe concerto. And it sounds a little strange to say that he's listing it in his estate catalog because he was dead. But in fact, his wife and daughter prepared the estate catalog basically on a manuscript that's presumed to have been prepared by C.P.E. Bach himself. So he was listing this concerto in its keyboard form when originally it was an oboe concerto, and we don't, as you said, we don't know that it was performed in his lifetime. There are a couple manuscripts here at the Library of Congress that further describe or depict how musical performance worked in a way that was different than necessarily what we find in our retrospective publishing of, or your retrospective publishing of a composer's complete works, because these were things that were out in the world and being performed, and not necessarily being performed by a composer himself, but by colleagues. So the two examples that I wanted to point to, so there are two oboe concertos. We'll hear one tonight. The other oboe concerto was also arranged for keyboard. And here at the Library of Congress, we have a manuscript copy of it. It's not in Bach's hand, but it can be associated with Bach fairly closely. And it dates from the 1770s, so during Bach's lifetime. And it's the keyboard version, not the oboe version. So that gives strong evidence that that other oboe concerto was in circulation and being performed, perhaps on a limited scale. Another example, though, we have a number of keyboard concertos in copies that were prepared by or for one of a 18th century musician by the name of Friedrich Wilhelm Rust, and he had studied with both Wilhelm Friedemann and then, he says he studied with Wilhelm Friedemann and also with C.P.E. Bach in Potsdam or Berlin. And these are interesting because on the surface, or by editorial standard, they're not reliable sources. So they transmit a version of the concertos that's not consistent with the autograph sources. So what hopefully you could explain is why would there be, if Friedrich Wilhelm Rust was a student of Bach's, why would he circulate or perform from a version of a concerto that wasn't a good version or an accurate version?
To Rust himself, it was, of course, an accurate version, and a non-corrupt version because that was the piece that he was playing and that's how he wanted to play it. The way Bach thought about composition was, and we know this from his Versuch, where he tells how to improvise a fantasia, is that you have a harmonic pattern as the basis of the piece, and then you improvise around that harmonic pattern. And the fixed form of the work that gets written down is just the form of the work as it was at that moment. And in his teaching, he would emphasize to his students that that's not the end of the story. You take what you have and then you make it your own by adding embellishments or even changing notes if you feel like it, as long as that basic harmonic pattern underneath isn't injured substantially. And in fact, Bach published 3 sets of keyboard sonatas that he called Reprisensonaten, in which he showed how you take this structure and you vary it. And he did this by publishing the first half of the sonata in the way that would be fixed by writing it down. And then when you repeat that half, normally you would just have repeat signs in the music and you'd go back and play that again. But he wrote out that first half again completely, and he said, and here is how you can do these embellishments to make it your own. And this was specifically to show how to do this. And that presents a problem to us as an editorial entity, because the concept that Bach is trying to get across here is, sure, you play it the way it's written the first time, but the second time you do your own thing. And so we've actually considered early on printing for the second half just blank music paper so that the performers would be forced to work it out on their own, but we decided to be not that mean, and we're publishing it the way Bach wrote out these embellishments. But the idea is to take the music and make it your own, and however you do that, that's valid for you. It's not valid for us as someone trying to publish the complete works of C.P.E. Bach, but it's valid for you, and that's, I'm sure, what happened in the case of Friedrich Wilhelm Rust. He took it and made it his own, and he was happy with it. And I'm sure Bach would have been happy with it too.
Right. So that poses an interesting question then for how a scholarly edition such as yours is used by performers, and how we approach the printed page or the printed music today. And one of the questions that sort of plagues performers, especially performers like the Akademie für Alte Musik Berlin, who we'll be hearing tonight, is the question of authenticity. And what I hear you saying is that an authentic performance would be one that deviates notably from the music as notated.
Yes, and that works particularly well for solo keyboard music. It does not work particularly well for ensemble music, where everyone would go off in their own direction. So in terms of orchestral music, the rules are a little more strict in that regard. But that there is the option for embellishment in certain cases, even in that situation.
It would be expected that a soloist, even in ensemble music, whether a vocalist or the oboist or whoever, that they would be embellishing and it's a kind of improvisation in their playing. But obviously you don't want the first and second violins who are accompanying them to also do a lot of embellishment too.
And I don't think Bach would have expected that to be the case either. But the expectation would have been, like you say, that the soloist would do something that introduces their own creativity into the performance. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's it's actually that's maybe another tangent that the another piece that's interesting that Paul and I were talking about earlier are cadenzas, and there are autograph versions. Cadenzas are sort of improvisations that happen in the course of a concerto movement, and there are autograph cadenzas that Bach wrote for his own concertos. And it's a couple weeks ago, I was in a panel discussion with the violinists Joan Kwan and Joel Smirnoff, and we were talking about Joachim's cadenzas for the Brahms Violin Concerto, and it's that tradition of cadenzas and performer-introduced improvisations or kind of inserted material by the performer was something that continued until the 20th century. And it certainly is standard for like a Mozart concerto or even a Beethoven concerto to be performed with original, not necessarily authoritative cadenzas. So cadenzas by somebody other than the composer.
Yeah, I think composer performers like Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and Mozart and Beethoven didn't need to write their own cadenzas. They could improvise their cadenzas during a performance. And so if you heard them play the same concerto 5 times, the cadenzas would be slightly different each time, or maybe wildly different each time, depending on what mood they were in, I suppose. But they did write down cadenzas. C.P.E. Bach, I think, wrote down cadenzas partly either to teach people how to play cadenzas. It becomes kind of a crutch, or Bob Levin calls it a pony, for people who aren't riding their own wild horses. I think sometimes it's also a way to preserve a particular performance. Well, it's the only way. They didn't have recordings at that time, so that was writing something down was the only way to preserve it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add on the written out cadenzas that we have by Bach. These are fairly short. The instrumental cadenza developed out of the vocal cadenza in operatic arias, where the rule was anything you can do in one breath is okay, but at the end of that breath you're done. And that carried over into these cadenzas that Bach wrote out. They're fairly short. So if you hear a C.P. Bach concerto with a 12-minute cadenza, you're either hearing someone who hasn't read his C.P. Bach or someone who has astounding lung capabilities.
So we've probably talked enough among ourselves, and it probably would be good to entertain questions that you may have. Yes, sir. Yeah, hold your question until the mic gets, or here.
Thank you. I just wondered if the new edition is prompting more performance recordings, and also what percentage of C.P.E. Bach's music has been recorded at this point?
That's a good question. I know that there have been quite a few performances just in the past couple of years based on our material, things that had never been published before. And there's, I don't know if it's available in this country yet, but there's a pianist who has done the complete solo keyboard recordings in, I think it's 26 CDs or something like that. That's all based on our edition, and that will be coming out soon. So in terms of it, and yes, there's an ongoing, two recording projects by Miklos Spanyi, one of the solo keyboard music and one of the keyboard concertos and sonatinas. And both of those projects had started maybe 15 or 20 years ago, and they're I think nearing completion now. So I would say overall, most of the keyboard music, keyboard works, chamber music, orchestral music have been recorded and are available. 90-some% of it, I think you could say. The vocal music a little bit less so. I know there's a recording of the complete Gellert Lieder. I don't think there are complete recordings of the other song collections yet. And the vocal music, there are recordings of some of the oratorios and a few of the occasional works, but there are quite a number of pieces that have not been performed or recorded yet. So it's probably closer to 40% or something like that for vocal music. Mark and I got to hear a performance of a couple of large-scale vocal works that Bach wrote in 1780 for the Bürgerkapitäns in Hamburg, and those works probably hadn't been performed at all since 1780.
I have a question. Two questions.
Wait,
Wait for the microphone. Here's a question.
yeah, there. We'll just use.
Do we know
One
of
second.
who of his contemporaries he actually met?
He writes in his autobiography that he met pretty much everybody. He did not meet Mozart or Haydn. Haydn made an attempt to meet him, but he was a bit late. He got to Hamburg shortly after Bach died. But C.P.E. Bach writes in his autobiography that any musician who passed through Leipzig pretty much had to play for his father, and he got to know quite a few musicians that way. His court connections in Berlin introduced him to quite a few composers, even ones that weren't directly active in Berlin. So he knew a fair number of his contemporaries.
Yeah, he had a very large portrait collection too, and it's very well represented by contemporary composers. That is, people born in his generation and even later. So he had a portrait of Haydn and Gluck and various others.
Was he as good as his father for playing different instruments? First question. Second question, did he ever write anything for the pianoforte?
No and yes. He was, in his youth, apparently quite a talented organist, but he gave it up probably when he left Leipzig, when he left direct contact with his father, and he says that he completely forgot how to play the pedals. His keyboard finger technique was probably on a par with his father's. Second part of the question?
Yeah, he did some of his late works, the Kenner and Liebhaber collections, for instance. On the title page, he says for the harpsichord or the forte piano. So and there's one of his last works is a double concerto for harpsichord and forte piano. So specifically for those two instruments.
I was going to add that J.S. Bach played the viola, we know, in performances, and any violinist who's played the sonatas and partitas, the unaccompanied sonatas and partitas by J.S. Bach, is painfully aware that they're entirely playable, if very difficult. And what's painful about that is that because they're so idiomatic, it seems obvious that Bach himself could play them. They demonstrate so much knowledge of the violin. I know that Wilhelm Friedemann, C.P.E.'s older brother, studied violin with Johann Gottlieb Graun, who was later a colleague of C.P.E. Bach's in Berlin. But did Emanuel study violin as well?
Not that we know of beyond just probably the basics he would have gotten at home.
Yeah, and the J.S. Bach was trained in the tradition of a guild musician, and that was sort of a jack of all trades, and that's probably why he was able to play the violin so well. His father was a violinist as well as a keyboard player, and that's kind of what you did. And that's very much the training that he imparted on his sons too. So I suspect that it would be the case that he had a basic familiarity with sort of those instruments, but Mark's further description of his keyboard skills is the most accurate description of what his performing abilities really tended towards.
Yes, hi. Just wondering where are all the original compositions all in one place, like in Leipzig, and is Library of Congress, do you have any copies of original sources?
There is an autograph here in the Library of Congress. In fact, is it still in the?
It's on display.
It's on display in the foyer of the concert hall, so you can have a look at it. There are also autograph letters in the Library of Congress, and then a lot of secondary copies here. The most primary source material is in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, and that came about because of this estate catalog. There was an auction in 1805. One of the purposes of the estate catalog was for Bach's widow and surviving daughter to derive income from copies being made of these pieces. So they sent out the estate catalog, and people would say, "I'd like a copy of this," and so they would have that copied out and sent. But the originals stayed with the Bachs and then were sold pretty much in one or two large blocks, an auction when his daughter died in 1805. And those blocks eventually ended up in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. I will add, though, that he was not as careful with his own autograph copies as you might expect. He would compose a piece and have an autograph copy, but then often these would be published, and for him, the published version then became the primary one, and he would give away the autograph or flip it over and use the empty backside for something else. And so we do not have autographs for everything. We do have what we call house copies, which were the copies that he kept in the house, whether prints or manuscripts, from which he could make copies for others. And that's those are the primary sources for the edition.
And we have about 85 of the contemporary printed editions of C.P.E. Bach's music. So these are primarily materials that were authorized editions, so published under the supervision or with the authority of Bach himself. We also have about 75 contemporary manuscript copies, what Mark described as secondary copies. These are very interesting because they demonstrate how Bach's music was being performed in his own lifetime, but not by Bach himself, but by his immediate colleagues.
And I just wanted to add too, I don't remember now whether we talked about the Thezing Academy collection, but when we started the edition in 1999, we were going to call it the collected works of C.P.E. Bach, because we did not have much of the later vocal music. Most of that survives in unique copies that was in the Thezing Academy collection and was presumed to be lost during the Second World War. Well, in 1999, it was found again in Kiev. It was had been put in storage in Silesia, which is now part of Poland, and it was found by a Soviet, the story goes it was found by a Soviet tank driver who deposited it back in Kiev at the conservatory. And it was basically held there as war booty until it was rediscovered in 1999 and returned to Berlin in 2001. So we basically started by projecting about 70 volumes worth of music, and with all this new material, mostly vocal music, we're now up to about 115. So about 40, we added about 40 volumes with that material.
And the Zing Academy collection still belongs to the Zing Academy, but it's on permanent loan at the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin.
Following up on that, we had a conference here some years back about the Zing Academy collection. And at that time, they showed examples in which J.S. Bach was teaching Wilhelm composition. And I was wondering if anything has turned up related to C.P.E.
Specifically in relation to his father?
His father teaching him.
No, that's a single example. We have this manuscript where it appears that Johann Sebastian Bach would start a fugue, and then Wilhelm Friedemann would come in and write a few measures, and then J.S. would come in and write a few measures. And as far as I know, that's unique. We don't have anything similar for C.P.E. Bach.
Last night, Mohan was talking about all of the women of the Bach extended families of musicians, and how they all made a very specific goal of marrying women who were musically talented, because they had the responsibility for raising the children to make sure that they continued in the musical tradition. And I'm just curious if you could provide any insights on that aspect of the Bach plan.
Well, that is not the case at all for C.P.E. Bach. He married the daughter of a wine merchant, and none of his children became professional musicians, probably because of that. Interesting, his youngest son was named Johann Sebastian Bach, and he became a skilled artist, but apparently he felt the pressure of being named Johann Sebastian Bach, and later in his life, he didn't live very long. I think he died in his late 20s, but later in his life, he actually preferred to be called Johann Samuel Bach to kind of dodge that pressure. The Bach family as musicians died out very quickly after Johann Sebastian Bach. We have 4 composing sons of J.S. Bach, and then we have 1 composing grandson, and after that, that's pretty much it. Johann Christian married a opera singer, so I guess that was extending the tradition. Wilhelm Friedemann did not marry a musician. Johann Christoph Friedrich also married a singer, which would reflect his mother, Anna Magdalena, who was also a singer.
And it was J.C.F. Bach's son who was the grandson.
Who was the musician, so.
Yeah. So I think that's all the time we have, it's so great to see so many people here. I think we'll be treated to a fantastic concert tonight, and we're so glad to have you, and thank you for your time.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.